talking, right? We're talking about, American exceptionalism, and we're talking about democracy and how it wasn't applied to everyone there, right? But eventually we moved in that direction. And one of the things that I have to keep in mind, that I always keep in mind, is I look at the overall long timeline of history, right? And I compare us in the context that we were in, not to deny, not to minimize or anything like that, right? But in the context.
And so I get what you're saying, that the whole world was living in this
at a very barbaric time, right?
Yeah, with the same mentality worldwide. It still doesn't make it any less.
You think about
repugnant.
the time. I agree, right? But we're looking at it from our view, from where we're at right now. That's how we're looking at it, right?
Yes.
So you think about it, right? So Spain had just been freed from Islamic rule, what, in 1500s or so?
Yeah, 1492.
In 1492, right? And then literally, Spain was a superpower. It was the equivalent of America at that time. Mm-hmm. If you were an unfortunate country and you looked up and you saw the Spanish Armada off your coast, you started quaking in your boots, right? And so it was a monarch, right? And I know so America is a colony, and we broke away, not consistent with the mythology that we were taught as kids, right? But overall, this idea of a voting right, of a written constitution, even though we were 3/4 human according to the Constitution, right? But we were moving in the direction. And it's because those values were placed there that people were able to say, hey, we have in our document that all men are created equal. And they begin to challenge the idea of white supremacy, which is a real thing, right? We can debate about how it's defined, how it manifests, right? But that prior to I'll say 65, right? It was in everything. It was pernicious. And the majority of Americans, black, white, whatever you want to say, were racist, held some type of racist view. And yes, black people can be racist because if you didn't pass the paper bag test, you were in trouble.
Yeah, you can look at all these old black and white TV shows, too. I grew up with apartheid television.
Yeah.
Not a single black person on, and if there was one on, it was a special event.
Oh, yeah. You got the whole, even into the 90s.
You can look at Bonanza, you can look at Johnny Yuma, you can look at all these shows, all white shows. There's no blacks on the shows. Mm-hmm. When one did appear, all the black
everybody would be watching.
All the black people would tune in because it was a rare event. Mm-hmm. And the only person you could go to would be Yaphet Kotto or Sammy Davis Jr. Mm-hmm. You could count on one hand the number of Paul Robeson, the number of black people that could appear in film or on TV. Mm-hmm. So now, black people are everywhere. Every commercial on TV's got a black person in it, almost. Yep. And sometimes more than one. But I grew up at a time when it was apartheid television. So white supremacy was the rule, and I think exceptionalism was the people that fought against that.
I think so too.
Yeah, and that's where that lies.
Now
for me.
the beautiful part about the part about our country that I think is the most wonderful thing is that we can dissent, because in a lot of other places you can't. And I certainly have lived in a variety of different places. And I know, like, you don't dissent in Saudi Arabia. Well, yeah, you don't pop up calling yourself going against something that's going on there.
But to dissent in America at that time, right? So I always have this fondness for quote unquote white Americans who dissented during the time frames that they did, right? Think about
because
the Freedom Riders.
That was a big.
The majority of those people were white. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. These were white teeth, and they're all like in their 70s now, right? So to me,
that goes back to the argument that you made about your friend. Mm-hmm. There's plenty to be proud of. Pull that out. Look at it and say that you're proud of joining together to free a people from an oppressive environment. Mm-hmm. That should be how history is being framed, and not framed in such a divisive way.
And people who mislabel themselves as white, in my opinion, are at a double loss in the sense that they've lost their own ethnicity. Mm-hmm. They were collapsed into a box called whiteness. Mm-hmm. And I often ask people, what were you before you were white? And they generally look at me and
don't know
strange.
What you're talking about.
Well, they were Irish and German. The box of whiteness, you can actually trace it to Enlightenment thinkers. You can trace it to a guy named Blumenbach, who created the term Caucasian. It didn't exist before that. Linnaeus, who talked about
What year
white,
was it? Like when? What was the date range on Bloom?
1700s.
So
These were Enlightenment thinkers who polluted. And see, that's the problem with, that was the beginning of the problem with democracy. It's better than a monarchy, but it was tainted with white supremacy from the very beginning. And so it's going to have that problem all along from back then to now. And so Blumenbach, Johann Blumenbach, 1700s, you can look him up if you like, he invented the term Caucasian. So what were people from Western Europe before they were white? They were German and French and Irish, et cetera, and they were collapsed into a box called whiteness. I make the argument that the reason we have freedom of religion is because they had to collapse that box. Because when the 13 colonies were originally existent, they teach this sugar-coated version of the 13 colonies. 13 colonies, there was a lot of religious hatred in every one of them. If you were a Catholic and you wound up in a Puritan colony, you would probably be burned at the stake or ran out of town. So how do you collapse religious hatred? You write a constitution that says you have freedom of religion. And so what happens though? You got to learn to hate someone else. So there's no other law that says you shouldn't hate people because of their skin color. But we can all agree that we're not going to hate each other because of religion, and that's where we get that First Amendment.
Interesting theory. I like that.
That's where we get that First Amendment from.
So, all right. So let's go back to this is the question because we have 16, 50 minutes. Is like what now, right? So we know history, right? You're a history buff. I'm a history buff, right? And so for me, the importance of history is to realize how we got where we're at, and then to also look and see some of the things that are still kind of going on. It's like Tiff and I, we're big. We cook a lot for Thanksgiving, and so we always talk about
we cook a lot for all the time.
Yeah,
That's why I need
it
to
shows,
be on a
right?
diet.
But one of the things I tell this story of a ham, right? There's this story out there where short version of the story is that 4 generations people pass down, they cut off the end of a ham, right? They always cut it off and they throw it away. And like by the time it gets to the 5th generation, they're like, why in the hell did we cut off this end of the ham? This is a good piece of the ham. And they go back to the grandmother, or the second great grandmother, and she says, because when I cut it off because we had a small pot. We couldn't put it all in there, but it goes forward 4 generations, right? And I feel like that sometimes when we're doing.
Well, you go backwards too when you talk about slave owners that ate high on the hog, and the slaves were given the leftovers. So where you cut the feet off of the hog, that's where we get hog feet from. That's where we get chitlins from. They threw away what they considered to be the bad parts, and of course Africans were very astute of how to turn something that was made negative into a delicious plate. Now, not everybody don't like chitlins, so don't get me they like chitlins. So don't get me wrong. But they were able to turn in food that was cast away by the slave owners into delicious plates in order to survive. And that makes me remember another thing. We think black-eyed peas will give you good luck on New Year's Day. Well, how did that happen? Well, General Sherman, who cut the Confederacy in half in his march across Georgia, he cut the Confederate army in half, which was going to ensure their defeat eventually. And when he did, he told all of his soldiers to burn everything. He believed in total war.
Yeah,
he burn
burn
everything.
He'd be a war criminal today.
Yeah, he'd be a war criminal today. Go up to the slave owner's house. The master's probably not there because he got drafted and he's all fighting unless he owned 20 or more slaves, because they had a thing called a 20 Negro law. But the owner of the house may not own it, may be gone, join the Confederacy. Burn that house down, or tell them they got a certain amount of time to free whatever slaves they have. If they give you any lip, fire any shot, drag a cannon up there and blow them out. Burn everything. Burn the corn, burn the wheat, but don't burn the black-eyed peas, because we need that for our horses. The horses eat black-eyed peas. By the way, black-eyed peas are an African food, but like watermelon. So they don't burn the black-eyed peas. So now the former slave owners are pro-slavery whites, and not all whites owned slaves, but they were pro-slavery because that was the American dream at the time. So now, to the laughter of slaves who are now free, they got to watch these pro-slavery men having to eat the very food that they were forced to eat because there was nothing left to eat. So black-eyed peas becomes good luck on New Year's days, not only just for the pro-slavery Confederates, but also for the black people. Oh, we've been eating black-eyed peas forever.
Yeah, I'm not a big black-eyed pea fan, and it's because one time my dad planted a whole acre of black-eyed peas. We had black-eyed peas forever and a day, and I'm not a big, that just.
I love black-eyed peas right now. All the time.
But answer the question.
Depending on how you cook them.
Yeah,
What
'cause you
now,
have to
right?
boil all that black water off.
So
Black-eyed peas is okay, go ahead.
So the question, the question that I ask myself, and that friends ask me, what now, Kevin? All right. So we say yes, we agree with you on this.
I have a
Where do we
question
go for
on
now?
this. In this time, like you see everything that's happening right now, is what prompted you to say, I need to put this out and get people.
That's a good question.
Well, I grew up in San Antonio. I was born and raised, and I heard all this stuff about the Alamo. One thing that bothered me, and I'll never forget this, they equated the Battle of the Alamo with the Battle of Thermopylae, which was the battle that the Greeks fought against the Persians. Supposedly, the story goes, 300 Spartans, and they made a movie about that. And many of y'all listening to the sound of my voice saw the movie, which is a total myth. But they had these 300 Spartans. That's not a myth. There were 300 Spartans. But what they don't tell you is there was about 6,000 barbarians fighting with them on the last day of the battle. So this 300 Spartan idea is a total myth. They didn't fight that battle all by themselves. And
There were 6,000 others.
yeah, 6,300, we'll say. So to equate the Battle of the Alamo with the Battle of Thermopylae is totally ludicrous. It's totally ludicrous. I never believed it for a second, even in elementary school, when one of the teachers was talking about the Battle of Alamo was like the Battle of Thermopylae. Well, how many soldiers were at the Battle of Thermopylae? Well, it was 1 million, and different historians use different numbers, but it was well over 100,000 Persian troops. And a narrow gorge, 300 Spartans supposedly holding the gorge. And the first thing I thought of is there's a door. Let me see, I can get maybe 20 people in front of that door, and we're going to hold back, 3,000 people bum rushing that door. You probably last about 15 minutes, if that. Mm-hmm. I don't care what kind of sword you got. I don't care what kind of shields you got. You're not going to last very long. So that whole argument about narrow gorge and only 300, it made no sense to me at all. So something was fishy, or something was rotten in Denmark with that story, as Shakespeare might say. But so that bothered me. And then as a kid, I'll never forget this. I had a friend of mine who said he bought a coonskin hat and he's embarrassed about it all his life. I said, yeah, I know what you mean. I said, because Crockett was a slave owner, Travis was a slave owner, Bowie was a slave owner, even the lowest private in the Texas Army was either pro-slavery or a slave owner, even if he only owned one slave. They were all slave owners. So I'm coming out of the Alamo with my father, probably 10 years old, I don't know, 9, I'm just guessing roughly. And this old man sees us coming out, walking across Alamo Street there. He said, did y'all just come out of there? And my father said, yeah. Well, everything in there is a lie. And he just walked off. And my father said nothing. We just kept on going. And that stuck in my mind all of my life. Stuck in my mind. And over the course of time, in talking to people who've been here all their life, and I would talk to people because I was in the civil rights movement for a long time. I would talk to Mexican Americans who would tell me the same thing. They don't believe any of that Alamo stuff. It's all a bunch of baloney. And then I actually found out from another professor, do you know there were black soldiers that fought the Battle of the Alamo? And I said, yeah, but on whose side? And he said, well, that's my point. There were thousands of black soldiers who fought on Santa Anna's side.
Because they were freeing slaves.
Not on the Alamo defenders' side.
Yeah.
They were not only freed slaves, freed by a colonel named Bradburn. By the way, Bradburn was a white guy from Kentucky who fought with the Mexican army, as did most, or many, I'll say many, Irish did. Because the Irish were Catholics. Mexico is a Catholic country. They were not about to fight with the Protestant Anglo-Saxon
Protestants. The complexity of that, right? Is not the history is not black and white. There's a lot of complexity to it. Yeah. And I think going through your book, that's what that's what I saw. That's what I read. You know, I think the title is very provocative, and I think if you
The
feel
title is very apropos.
there we go, apropos, it's provocative for me, and so anything that
Well, it's provocatively apropos.
yeah, so
That's right. There you go.
So Tiffany gets mad at me, right? So I have a couple books like there. Anything that makes me repulse, I want to read it.
Yeah.
Let me go read
good
it.
for you.
And I have a couple titles like that. At several titles.
I don't
at the
think
house.
it's that it makes you repulsed.
It makes me
Anything
stop
that
and
startles
think.
you.
That startles me. That's a
Yeah.
better word. That's a better
Startle.
word. That startles me. And your title
Now,
startled
for me,
me.
that's I
And
don't
then
find
all
this
of the-
startling at all.
And then as I was reading through, as we were looking through the news, I think it was a big hoopla about it on the news. I was just like, let me get that book, right? Yeah. You know,
You know what I find funny is that, well, you don't want to be using me as a litmus test because
Oh, well.
apparently I am startling and in your face too. I didn't know this. I don't think of myself that way. But my producer's laughing, holding back.
Well, and some of this is not even new.
Yeah.
It's just that it's not well publicized.
Yeah.
And I mentioned,
But it's the truth. You know, the thing about the truth is always going to come to light.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody is going to look at it and have the fortitude and personal character. We're always talking about things like character, integrity, these important values that we assign to being an American. Well, that's exactly what Professor Salas is. That's what it takes to bring something like this
It does. And I think
to
it's
the
a good
forefront and to do the proper research on it so that he can say, hey,
there's a couple of books that are really, I think, are a gold mine about understanding the Alamo. One is by Dr. Phillip Tucker, and this is a provocative title as well, called The Alamo, Exodus from the Alamo, The Anatomy of the Last Stand Myth. That's the title of Dr. Phillip Tucker's book. PhD, he's a military,
he's a military.
He's a military historian, by the way.
All right.
Ooh, I love it.
So
We need to call him.
and then the other gold mine book, and we can talk about that later, but the other gold mine book is Todd Nelson. It's probably 900 pages long. And what he does, and he's not even a historian.
Yeah, and he just like in that guy Nelson, and he just like a very avid historian.
History buff.
History buff, but he goes through. He goes to the original material.
Oh yeah, but he goes to newspaper clippings, report after report after report, and then gives, in his opinion, what sounds to be accurate and what sounds to be totally false. One of the things he does talk about is the number of Alamo defenders that ran. They didn't stay there to fight; they ran.
Because the Santa Anna's army was huge.
Yeah. Well, but it wasn't the 7,000 in the John Wayne movie. It was only about, because that's a myth too. There was only about 3,000 fighters that Santa Anna brought with him, and only 1,500 of them probably saw action. And they came over the northern wall, and the Alamo was much bigger than it is now. It was encompassed all of that Woolworth building all the way across the street, went further north. But according to Joe the slave, and I don't like to call him that, he should have a last name. I call him Joe Boone because his mother was probably the victim of a rape by Daniel Boone. So I call him Joe Boone. I call him Joe Travis. He was a slave of William Travis. He said that over 500 Mexican troops were over the wall before a single shot was ever fired. It was 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, not in the middle of the day like the movie. It was pitch black. And Crockett was quoted in Nelson's book and other people's book too as saying on several occasions that I had rather die out in the open than be hemmed up in these 4 walls. So there is, I think, educated speculation that he led about 100, 120 men out of the southern and eastern walls, because, you know, in any war, there's always going to be cowardice. There's always going to be, I want to live to fight another day. I'm not a coward. Maybe we can make it to Gonzales because there was extra troops there. Mm-hmm. So some of them ran thinking make it to Gonzales. Some ran because they were cowards. Mm-hmm. Who knows detail, you know, from one person to the next. But the documentation shows majority of them ran. About 60, the numbers vary, 60 to 75 died they were asleep on. It was cold. I don't know what. It was a blue northerner, blew through San Antonio. It was below freezing. They were caught off guard. They couldn't get to their guns in time, so the majority of them were killed in the long cabin, or the long barracks, they call it, before anything could ever be happen. Bruce Winders, in his book, he writes, another good historian, he used the term most of the defenders were pushed out of the Alamo, which means they ran. and so this is all kinds of stuff that I come to find out growing up in a town, living in the shadow of the Alamo, living in the shadow of something that's just simply not true, when we ought to be told the truth. And the truth of any pudding is in the taste. The truth of your wife's best cake is in the taste. So you can talk about how good that cake is, but until you taste it, that's going to tell you the story. When the Texas Constitution was written after the Battle of the Alamo and after the Battle of San Jacinto, they made slavery legal in the Texas Constitution.
That's true. That's there. Yeah.
That's the proof of the pudding of what this battle was all about to begin with. So the Battle of San Jacinto, in my opinion, had to be the worst day in the life of any African American living in Texas at that time.
And it was, because they represented, as we talked about with Professor Berry from UT, is that there was a dollar amount assigned to slaves. And actually, when you look at the end of the Civil War, when slaves were emancipated, right, you lost $3 billion, a little bit over $3 billion in financial worth that was free, right? And so that's there. We're almost running out of time. So the question that I ask is, for me, right, my answer to this is, what now, right? So
what would you like to see?
Yeah, what would you like to see? What now?
No, we still got a big problem with racism in this country. We still got a big problem with racial killings. You saw what happened in Buffalo the other day, with mass shooting of African Americans targeted. We just saw.
He drove 200 miles.
Yeah, we just saw the killing of. We just saw the city settle a huge complaint against police for the killing of Jesse Gairy, Anton Scott. Huge amounts of money, because these were policemen that should have never been policemen to begin with. There are an awful lot of good policemen, but unfortunately, there's enough bad ones to make the whole system in bad shape. So we still have this problem of white supremacy. We have a governor that's trying to tell people what they can teach in school. You can't teach African American studies, or you can't say anything about Nat Turner's rebellion, or you can't say anything that contradicts the mythology of American history. We are facing some serious problems that are racially motivated, in my opinion.
Okay. So we'd say policing and policy is one of the things there, which I think we could do more there. And then also education and bringing in
because history should be taught. That's the
the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, you just say it all. It doesn't. It's not. It shouldn't be whitewashed or sugar-coated or however you want to, whatever phrase you want to use. History is history.
Yeah, and the scholar in me wants to go into more detail to unpack a
Well,
lot of things just said.
We got to bring Professor Salas back.
We can stay here all day.
Yeah, because there's more to this, right? It's not as black and white or as simple as the idiots on TV would have you believe. You could just, we're just going to say this here. But there is nuance, there is depth to everything that he just said, right, that we could go into.
And it is worth your time and your dollars to go and pick up a copy of The Alamo, A Cradle of Lies, Slavery and White Supremacy.
And start in the bibliography.
Read the book, because it's enlightening.
Yeah.
And and it's historical fact. The very subject that we discuss over and over again, history being taught in schools, this is American history. Black history is American history.
And this really isn't. We'll just move on.
Now, I know this isn't Black history.
This is a great book.
But this is American history. The Alamo and what happened there is American.
It's got some Black history in it.
It does have some Black history. Yeah. I like it. It's a good book. I would. Tiff and I argue about our methodologies. I would start in the appendix, in the biology, in the bibliography, and the notes. and you can just trace and you can see where he's getting his data from and the information that he's bringing into it. For me, that's always, that determines if it's worth my read, right? And it was worth my read, right?
Professor Salas is having a book signing June 4th,
Tiffany,
right?
you're unfortunately or fortunately, you're stuck with an intellectual. That's the problem.
Lord, and that's why I married him. That's what he sucked me in with that before I found out about his divergent view. No, I'm just kidding.
And you know, the great thing, since we're running out of time here, but the great thing, right, that I really appreciate about is that Tiff and I are proof. We can have difference of opinions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just like, I don't know if I believe that.
And
she's like, you have to give me more, Kevin. And
But
so,
the deal is that, the premise of our show is that we're more alike than we are different.
And we are different.
And you have to hear what all of the thinking is and you have to hear truth. Truth is important.
And life is more than just a soundbite.
Exactly.
So you've been listening to On the Record with Tiffany.
And Kevin.
And thank you so much, Professor Salas. And do you have one parting thought?
Well, it might be too provocative, but nevertheless, read the primary source documentation. You don't have to take my word for it. It's not presentism. It's what the people that believed in evil things, this is what they said. This is not what I'm saying. So that's important. That's what I would suggest people do. Read the documents. They fought the Civil War because of slavery. I didn't say that. They say that in the Texas Articles of Succession. The slave owners themselves say that. That's not me saying it. So I always like to address that false argument.
Yeah.
Once again, read. You cannot get your information just from sound bites. Read.
Yep, I agree.